Tonight, we examine a case that once occupied the attention of an entire county and then slipped quietly into the historical record. A single investigation, a single file, a case that history very nearly forgot. The case of Margery Wren begins in Ramsgate, in the county of Kent, in the autumn of 1930. Ramsgate was a seaside town on the Isle of Thanet, at the far eastern edge of Kent, where the land runs out into the North Sea and the coast turns in a series of chalk cliffs and harbours. In 1930 it was a town of some 40,000 people, a place of fishermen and boarding houses, of a harbour crowded with small craft, and of a long promenade that filled with visitors in the summer months and emptied again when the season closed. The town had grown through the previous century as a resort, a destination reached by railway from London and by steamer along the coast, and by 1930 it carried the settled character of a working seaside community rather than a fashionable retreat. The grand terraces above the harbour had been built for an earlier age. Behind them lay the ordinary streets of the residents, the shopkeepers, the tradesmen and the retired, and it was in one of these streets that Margery Wren kept her shop. The year itself belongs to the period between the two great wars. The first had ended 12 years earlier, and the second was still 9 years distant. It was a time of economic difficulty across Britain, of unemployment and reduced circumstances, and the anxieties of that period, the concern with money and its scarcity, would come to frame much of what was later said about the case. Motor traffic had come to the streets of the town, though it shared them still with horse-drawn carts and delivery vehicles. The wireless had entered the homes of those who could afford it. Newspapers were read widely and printed in several editions through the day, and it was through the newspapers that the events at Ramsgate would reach the attention of the nation. Policing had grown into a modern institution, with a county constabulary in Kent, and in London, the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, whose detectives could be sent by train to any part of the country when a local force required assistance. Church Road was a quiet, residential street set back from the seafront, a street of modest houses and small businesses of the kind found in every English town of the period. Number 2. Church Road was a small shop with living quarters above and behind it. The shop itself was cramped, fitted with a counter and shelves, and it sold the small goods of daily household use, sweets kept in jars, packets of household items, blancmange powder, and similar articles. It was the sort of shop that served the immediate neighbourhood, its custom drawn from the surrounding streets, its trade small and steady and unremarkable. Behind the shop lay a back room with a fireplace, and a narrow stair led up to the rooms above where the shopkeeper lived. The whole premises was small, enclosed and private, and it had been the home and the place of business of Margery Wren for a great many years. The documentary record of Margery Wren's early life is thin, and it must be treated as such. What can be established is limited. She was born around the year 1850, though the exact year is not certain, and the sources that survive give her age at the time of her death variously as 79, as 80, and as 82. For this reason, she is best described simply as being about 80 years of age. Her parents' names are not reliably recorded in the accessible sources, nor are their occupations, nor the social origin from which she came. These are genuine gaps in the record, and they cannot be filled with certainty. What is known is that by 1930 she had lived and traded at 2 Church Road for a great many years, a period that several sources place at roughly 40. For 4 decades, in other words, she had stood behind the same counter in the same small shop on the same quiet street. She had not always lived alone. For much of that time she had shared the shop and the lodgings above it with a sister. The 2 women had kept the premises together and had lived together in the rooms above the trade. The sister, however, had died before her, leaving Margery Wren entirely alone in the house. She never married. She had no husband and no married name, and she is recorded throughout the case file as a spinster, a woman who had lived her whole, long life without marrying. By 1930, she was an elderly woman living by herself keeping a small shop in a house she had occupied for the greater part of her adult life. If the facts of her origins are scarce, her character and reputation are, by contrast, well attested. They are recorded in the newspaper accounts of 1930 and in the later published recollections of the detective who led the investigation. She was described as small in stature and sharp in manner, a woman fiercely independent and intensely private. She was frugal to the point of secrecy, guarded in her dealings, and suspicious of those who called at her door. She admitted almost no one to the back room of her shop. She kept her affairs to herself, and she was widely believed throughout the neighbourhood to have money hidden somewhere about the premises, despite the modest appearance of her shop and her plain manner of living. This belief, that she was better off than she looked, that there was cash concealed somewhere in the small rooms of 2 Church Road, was held commonly among those who knew her, and it would become central to everything that followed. The detective, who was later sent to investigate her death, Chief Inspector Walter Hambrook of Scotland Yard, wrote of her afterward in terms that have attached themselves permanently to the case. He described her as the most obstinate, the most inflexible, and the most determined person he had encountered in the whole of his police career. That characterization, offered by the man who led the investigation into her death, carries a particular weight, because the entire course of the investigation would turn upon precisely those qualities. An obstinate woman, an inflexible woman, a woman determined beyond the ordinary measure. These were not idle words. They described the one obstacle that the investigation was never able to overcome. Now back to the record. The life that Margery Wren led in the last years before her death was solitary and unvarying. She lived above and behind the shop, and she traded alone. The shop occupied the front of the premises, the private rooms lay above and behind, and between the two she moved through her days, according to a routine that changed very little. She opened the shop, she served her small custom, and she kept her own company. She admitted few visitors to the back room, which she regarded as her own private space, separate from the trade at the counter. Callers at the shop came to the counter, made their small purchases, and left. Beyond the counter, into the back room and up the stair, very few were permitted to go. Her savings, if the common belief of the neighbourhood was correct, were kept on the premises rather than in a bank. This was not an unusual arrangement for a person of her age and generation, and it belonged to a recognisable type of the period, the independent elderly shopkeeper who distrusted banks and kept her money close at hand. In the economic climate of 1930, with its anxieties about money and its widespread hardship, such a belief carried a particular charge. A woman thought to keep cash hidden in a small and poorly guarded house was, in the reasoning that the investigation would later follow, a woman exposed to a particular danger. The belief that she had money on the premises supplies the obvious motive of robbery, though it must be said plainly that this motive, however obvious, was never proven. It remained a theory, and it must be treated as one. There is a further line of inquiry that the investigation would later pursue, and it too must be marked carefully. It was said that certain local men owed her money, that she had lent or been owed sums by people in the district. This raised the possibility that her death arose not from a robbery by a stranger, but from a confrontation over a debt, a dispute over money owed, escalating to violence. The police examined this possibility. They looked at callers at the shop and at men said to be in her debt. But the theory of a debtor known to her, like the theory of robbery, was never substantiated. It stands in the record as a line of police inquiry, not as an established fact, and it must be presented as such. Whether Margery Wren lent money, and to whom, and whether any such arrangement bore upon her death, was never determined. Her last known movements before the attack were entirely ordinary. Saturday, the 20th of September 1930, was a trading afternoon like any other. The shop was open. The town went about its business. There was nothing in the day, so far as anyone could later establish, to distinguish it from the countless similar afternoons that had preceded it across her 40 years behind the counter. She was in her shop, in the small enclosed world of her Church Road, and the street outside was quiet. What is known is that at some point during that afternoon, within the premises, during shop hours, she was attacked. The attack took place in the back room, the private space into which she admitted so few, and whoever was there with her in that room was a person against whom, in the days that followed, she would not speak a single word of accusation. The precise sequence of what occurred in that back room cannot be reconstructed with certainty, because there was only one witness who survived it, and that witness would not speak of it plainly. What the investigation was able to establish is limited, and it is best stated with restraint. An assailant was present with her in the shop and the back room during that Saturday afternoon. An attempt was made to strangle her. She was then struck repeatedly about the head with the fire tongs belonging to the shop, the iron implement kept at the fireplace in the back room. The injuries she received were severe, but she was not killed outright. This is the single most remarkable fact of the physical event, and it shaped everything that came after. The attack, savage though its effect was, did not end her life in the moment it was delivered. She survived it, and she remained conscious. When the assailant had gone, Margery Wren did not lie where she had fallen. Injured as she was, bleeding from the head, she made her way from the back room out into the passage of the premises. There she was found. A young girl from the neighbourhood, a child who lived nearby, called at the shop that afternoon to make an ordinary purchase. She had come to buy a packet of blancmange powder, one of the small household articles the shop sold, an errand of the most commonplace kind. Instead of finding the shopkeeper at her counter, ready to serve, the child found Margery Wren in the passage, dazed and bleeding, having staggered from the room in which she had been attacked. The child was a young neighbour, unharmed, and her part in the events was brief. She had come for a packet of powder and had found an injured woman, and the alarm was raised from that moment. The response was immediate. Neighbours were summoned, and a doctor was called to the premises. The injured woman was attended to and taken to Ramsgate Hospital, where she was put to bed, and here the case turns upon the fact that made it unlike almost any other. Margery Wren did not die. She had been strangled and beaten about the head, an elderly woman of about 80, and yet she survived the attack, and she remained lucid for much of the 5 days that followed. For 5 days she lay in a hospital bed, attended by a doctor, visited by the police, conscious and able to speak. The one person in all the world who knew with certainty what had happened in that back room, and who had done it, lay alive and able to answer questions for the better part of a week. This circumstance is, in the annals of English crime, very nearly unique. The gravity and the strangeness of the case were apparent at once, and they drew a response beyond the ordinary. The Kent constabulary attended to the immediate matters, but the nature of the crime, an elderly woman attacked in her own shop and lingering near death, and the peculiar difficulty that soon became apparent, brought the involvement of Scotland Yard. Chief Inspector Walter Hambrook of the Metropolitan Police was sent down from London to lead the inquiry. Hambrook was a detective of standing and long experience, a well-known figure of the Yard in that period, and he travelled to Ramsgate by train to take charge of the investigation. He would later write of the case in his published recollections, and it is in part through his account that the details of those 5 days survive. What he found on his arrival was a situation without precedent in his experience. He had a victim who was alive, he had a victim who was conscious, and he had a victim who would not tell him what had happened. The central feature of the investigation, the feature that defines the entire case, was this: the victim herself was available for questioning repeatedly over a period of 5 days, and she would not identify her attacker. More than that, the accounts she gave shifted constantly, and they were incompatible with one another. She did not tell one consistent story that concealed a name. She told several stories, and they could not all be true, and she moved between them. At one point she said that she had fallen, that her injuries were the result of an accident. At another, she said that she had caught herself, or injured herself, upon the tongs. At another, she said that no one had come to the shop at all, that there had been no visitor, no assailant, nothing. And then at another point, she said that a man had indeed come to the shop, but she would not say who he was. The investigation pressed her, gently and repeatedly, as gently as the circumstances of an elderly and gravely injured woman required, and as persistently as the gravity of the crime demanded. Officers and the doctor put questions to her over the days of her decline, and on one occasion, according to the accounts that survive, she began to give a name. She started to speak it, and then she stopped, and she withdrew it, and she would not complete it. She had come to the edge of naming the man who had attacked her, and she had drawn back from it. This single moment, a name begun and abandoned, is perhaps the most telling detail in the whole record. It indicates that she knew the name. It indicates that she could have given it. And it indicates that her silence was not the silence of ignorance or confusion, but the silence of choice. The police proceeded with every ordinary line of inquiry that the circumstances allowed. The premises were searched, the town was searched, callers at the shop were interviewed, and neighbours were questioned, and the local men who were said to owe her money were sought out and examined. The theory of robbery was pursued, and with it the belief that she kept savings hidden on the premises, for if that were the motive, then something might have been taken, or someone might have known of the money and come for it. The theory of a debtor known to her was pursued as well, the possibility that a man in her debt had come to the shop, and that a dispute over money had ended in violence. Every avenue that the investigation could follow, it followed. But each of them ran into the same obstacle, which was that the one person who could have resolved the matter with a single word refused to speak that word. This is the peculiar difficulty of the Margery Wren case, and it is worth stating plainly, because it is unusual. In most investigations, the difficulty is the absence of a witness. Here there was a witness. The difficulty was not that no one had seen the crime. The victim had seen it, had lived through it, and had survived to speak of it. The difficulty was that the witness would not tell what she had seen. The police were, by the accounts that survive, entirely certain that she knew who had attacked her, and that she could have named him, had she chosen to. Her injuries had not deprived her of her memory or her speech. She remained, in the words used of her, sharp and lucid. Her silence was deliberate, and a deliberate silence, however complete, leaves an investigator with nothing to act upon, for a name that is never spoken cannot be pursued, and a suspect who is never identified cannot be charged. On the last occasion that she was pressed to name the man, in the final period before her death, she gave the words that have remained attached to the case ever since. She said that she did not want him to suffer. She said that he must bear his sins. Those two sentences are the nearest thing the case possesses to a clue, and they are the most widely and reliably reported of all the words she spoke in those 5 days. They are not the words of a woman who does not know her attacker. They are the words of a woman who knows him, who has some feeling toward him, some regard or some pity or some sense of an old connection, and who has decided that whatever he has done, she will not be the one to deliver him to the law. She would leave his sins to be borne by him before whatever judgment she believed in, and she would not add the judgment of the courts to it. Having said this, she did not name him, and she died without ever having named him. Margery Wren died on the 25th of September 1930, 5 days after the attack, in Ramsgate Hospital. She had lived for 5 days with injuries that would, in the end, prove fatal, and through those 5 days she had held her silence unbroken. The consequences of the assault, the injuries to the head and the shock of such violence upon a woman of about 80 years, brought about her death. She succumbed to what had been done to her on that Saturday afternoon, and she carried the name of the man who did it out of the world with her. The examination of the medical facts fell to one of the most eminent figures in the country. Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the Home Office pathologist, conducted the post-mortem examination. Spilsbury was, in that period, the foremost medical witness in English criminal proceedings, a man whose findings carried extraordinary authority in the courts, and whose name was attached to a great many of the notable cases of the age. His involvement in the Ramsgate case is firmly established. His finding was decisive upon the one point that mattered most, and that point was the question of whether the injuries could have been self-inflicted. Margery Wren, in her shifting accounts, had said that she had fallen and that she had caught herself upon the tongs. If that were possible, then there was no crime to investigate. Spilsbury's examination settled the matter. The injuries could not possibly have been self-inflicted. They were not the result of a fall nor of any accidental contact with the tongs. They had been inflicted by another person. This finding demolished the innocent explanations that the victim herself had offered. It established beyond medical doubt that she had been attacked, that a crime had been committed, and that the accounts in which she attributed her injuries to accident were untrue. It did not, of course, identify the attacker. Medicine could establish that a crime had occurred, and it could establish the manner in which the injuries had been caused, and it could establish the cause of death, which was the consequence of the assault upon an elderly woman. What medicine could not do was supply the name that the victim withheld. Spilsbury's authority settled the question of what had happened. It could not settle the question of who had done it. The cause of death was determined, the fact of murder was established, and the identity of the murderer remained exactly where Margery Wren had left it, unspoken. An inquest was convened, as the law required, before the coroner having jurisdiction in Ramsgate and the Isle of Thanet. The purpose of a coroner's inquest is to determine the identity of the deceased and the place and time and manner of death, and to return a formal verdict upon it. The evidence placed before the inquest was the evidence that the 5 days had produced. There was the account of the young neighbour who had called at the shop for a packet of blancmange powder and found the injured woman in the passage. There were the accounts of the neighbours who had come to her aid and of the doctor who had attended her. There was the medical evidence of Sir Bernard Spilsbury and his finding that the injuries could not have been self-inflicted, which established that the death was the result of an unlawful act. And there was the account given by the police of the investigation they had conducted and of the victim's persistent refusal, through all the days of her lucidity, to name the person who had attacked her. The inquest weighed these matters, and it returned the only verdict that the evidence would support. The jury found that Margery Wren had been murdered by some person or persons unknown. This is the formal verdict of a coroner's inquest in a case where a death has plainly been caused by an unlawful act, but where no individual can be identified as responsible. It records that a murder was committed. It records that the person who committed it is not known. There was no committal to trial, for a committal requires a person to commit, an accused to be sent forward to answer the charge. There was no such person. The verdict of murder by some person or persons unknown was entered into the record, and with it the formal legal proceedings arising from the death of Margery Wren came in effect to their end. No trial was ever held. It is important to state this plainly, because the shape of most criminal narratives leads toward a trial, toward the assembling of a case and the testing of it before a jury, and the delivery of a verdict upon a named defendant. None of that occurred here. No person was ever charged with the murder of Margery Wren. No person was arrested for it, and no person stood in the dock to answer for it. The investigation, thorough as it was, and led by an experienced detective of Scotland Yard, produced no charge, because it could produce no name, because the one person who possessed the name would not give it. Where there is no accused, there can be no trial, and where there is no trial, there can be no verdict of guilt or innocence, no conviction, and no sentence. There was, in consequence, no sentence and no punishment of any kind. The machinery of justice which exists to try the accused and to punish the guilty had nothing to act upon. The immediate aftermath of the death was not a prosecution, but a press sensation. The case attracted intense interest, both in Kent and across the nation. The newspapers reported it widely, and they seized upon the feature that made it extraordinary. It became known as the Ramsgate shop mystery, and it was spoken of as the case of the woman who would not name her killer. That single element, the refusal of a dying woman to identify the person who had attacked her, when she plainly could have done so, was what lifted the case out of the ordinary run of provincial crimes and fixed it in the public attention. A robbery gone wrong, an elderly shopkeeper killed for her savings, would have been reported and forgotten. A victim who shielded her own murderer with her dying breath was something else, and the public sensed it, and the newspapers gave it space accordingly. The later published reflections of Chief Inspector Hambrook did much to cement the case in memory. Having led the investigation, he wrote of it afterward as one of the most singular cases of his career. It was his account, more than any other, that carried the story forward into the literature of unsolved English crime, and that preserved the details of those 5 days and of the words she spoke. Through his telling and through the newspaper record, the case survived the closing of the file, and it passed into the collections of unsolved crimes that were compiled in the years and decades that followed. Of the disposal of her body, the record available is incomplete. Margery Wren was buried in Ramsgate, in the town where she had lived and traded for the better part of a lifetime, and where she had died. The exact place of her burial is not confirmed in the accessible sources, and no reliable detail of a graveside or a marker survives in them. What can be said is that an elderly woman who had lived alone, whose sister had died before her, and who had never married, was laid to rest in the town that had been the whole compass of her long life. She left behind her the small shop, the rooms above it, and the belief, never confirmed and never disproved, that somewhere within them she'd kept the money that may have cost her her life. There is a further element of the case that belongs properly to the record, and it concerns the matter that was never resolved and that gives the case its enduring character. The question at the centre of it is not the ordinary question of an unsolved crime, which is simply the question of who did it. There is a second and stranger question laid over the first, which is the question of why the victim protected the person who killed her. In most unsolved cases, the silence lies with the absence of witnesses. Here the silence lay with the victim herself, and it was not the silence of death, but the silence of a living, speaking, lucid woman who chose to withhold what she knew. The theories that the police pursued, of robbery by a man who knew of her hidden money, and of a debtor known to her, whose dispute over money had turned to violence, address the first question. They offer possible answers to who. They do not answer the second question. They do not explain why a woman would refuse to name the man who had strangled her and beaten her, and would say instead that she did not want him to suffer, and that he must bear his sins. The possibilities that have been raised in the accounts of the case are only that, possibilities, and none was ever established. It has been suggested that the man was someone she had known personally, and for a long time, perhaps since he was a boy, and that an old and settled affection, or a sense of connection reaching back many years, stayed her tongue. It has been suggested that he was a relative, a person of her own blood, whom she would not deliver to the law, however grievously he had wronged her. It has been suggested that the connection was one of long acquaintance in the small and settled community of the town, where she had stood behind her counter for 40 years and had watched a generation grow up around her. But these are suggestions only. No individual was ever identified, and no relationship was ever proven, and it must be stated firmly that the man was never named and can never now be named. To attach a name to him on the strength of theory would be to invent what the record does not contain. The record contains an absence where the name should be, and that absence is permanent. What the record does establish, with certainty, is the single behavioural fact upon which the whole case turns. She knew her attacker, the police were entirely certain of it, and her own conduct proved it, for a woman who did not know her attacker could not have begun to speak his name and then withdrawn it. She could have named him, and she chose, through 5 days of questioning, through the presence of an experienced detective sent from London for that very purpose, and through the approach of her own death, not to do so. That choice is the heart of the case. It is a choice that the law could not override, that the investigation could not overcome, and that the passage of time has not explained. An elderly woman, attacked in her own shop, given 5 days in which to accuse the man who had done it, declined the accusation and took the answer with her. In the years that followed, the case took its place in the literature of unsolved British crime, where it has remained. It recurs in the anthologies and collections of unexplained murders that were compiled through the middle of the 20th century and after. It appears in the local history of Thanet and of Ramsgate, where the memory of it has been strongest, the killing of the old shopkeeper of Church Road being the sort of event that a town does not readily forget. It has been revisited in more recent accounts, including local publications of the Isle of Thanet, which have returned to it as one of the district's enduring mysteries. It did not pass into film, and it did not pass into song. There is no ballad of Margery Wren and no dramatic adaptation of her death. Its afterlife has been the quieter afterlife of the true crime record, of the printed account and the retold case, of the entry in the collection of murders that were never solved. It is remembered as a case, not as a legend, and the memory of it is the memory of a puzzle rather than of a story with an ending. The place it holds in that literature is a particular one. It is cited again and again as perhaps the most striking example in English criminal history of a victim who shielded an assailant. Cases in which a witness will not speak from fear are common enough. Cases in which a family closes ranks around one of its own are known, but a case in which the victim, the one person most wronged, the one person with every reason to accuse, and with the law and the doctor and the detective all urging her to accuse, instead protects the very hand that killed her, and does so knowingly, and to the last, is rare to the point of singularity. That is the reason the case has survived. Not for its violence, which was ordinary enough in its outline, an old woman robbed or quarrelled with and struck down, but for the silence at its centre, which was extraordinary. The setting in which it occurred lends it a particular character as well. This was England between the wars in the year 1930, in a small seaside town on the Kentish coast. It was a world in which an elderly woman might keep a small shop for 40 years, might distrust the banks and keep her money by her, might live alone above her trade and admit few callers, and might be known to the whole neighbourhood as a fixture of the street. It was a world in which a young girl might be sent to buy a packet of blancmange powder and might walk into the aftermath of a murder. It was a world in which a county constabulary, faced with a crime beyond its ordinary compass, might send to London for a detective, and a man of Scotland Yard might come down by train to sit at a dying woman's bedside. And it was a world in which the great pathologist of the age might be called upon to say whether an old woman's injuries could have been her own doing, and might say, with the authority that his name carried, that they could not. All of these belong to their moment, to the particular texture of interwar England, and they frame the human fact at the centre of the case, which belongs to no particular age at all. The economic anxieties of that period press upon the case as well, for the belief that Margery Wren had money hidden about her premises was a belief that carried force in a time of hardship, when work was scarce and money short, and when the thought of cash concealed in a poorly guarded house might tempt a desperate man. The robbery theory drew its plausibility from the conditions of the year as much as from the character of the victim, and the theory of the debtor drew its plausibility from the same source, from a time in which small debts between neighbours were common and the pressure to repay them could be severe. These were the ordinary economic realities of a provincial English town in 1930, and they supplied the ordinary motives that the investigation naturally pursued. What they could not supply was an explanation for the response of the victim, which was not ordinary, and which no economic condition accounts for. The case file itself survives, and its survival is part of the record. The papers of the Metropolitan Police investigation into the death of Margery Wren are held at the National Archives, catalogued as the murder of Margery Wren at Ramsgate on the 20th of September 1930. That a file exists at all, and that it has been preserved through the decades, is a consequence of the very fact that the case was never closed by a conviction. A case that ends in a trial and a sentence is, in a sense, completed. Its papers may be retained, but the matter is settled. A case that ends without an arrest remains, in the language of the police, open, and its file is the file of an unresolved matter, retained against the possibility, however remote, that something might one day be added to it. Nothing ever was. The file records the investigation as it stood when the investigation ended, and it has stood in that condition ever since, a complete account of an incomplete inquiry. The town in which the case occurred had its own long history, and something of that history bears upon the world in which Margery Wren lived and died. Ramsgate had risen through the 18th and 19th centuries as a harbour and a resort, its fortunes tied to the sea. Its harbour had been built and rebuilt across the generations, and it had served as a station for cross-channel traffic and for the fishing fleet, and in time as a haven for the pleasure craft and the coastal steamers that brought visitors from London and elsewhere. The town that grew up around the harbour was a mixed one, with the fine crescents and terraces of its resort, years standing above the plainer streets of the people who lived and worked there through the whole of the year, and not merely the season. By 1930, the great years of the resort were behind it, and the town had the settled and slightly faded character of a place that had once been more fashionable than it now was. It remained a working town, its permanent population going about the ordinary business of a provincial community, its shops serving its own residents through the long months when the visitors were gone. Church Road belonged to that ordinary and permanent Ramsgate rather than to the Ramsgate of the promenade and the season. It was a street of residents, of people who lived there through the year, and of the small businesses that served them. A shop such as Margery Wren's depended upon precisely that permanent custom, upon the households of the surrounding streets who came for their sweets and their household packets and their small daily needs. It was not a business that flourished upon the summer trade of visitors. It was a neighbourhood shop in a neighbourhood street, and its keeper was a neighbourhood figure, known to the families around her, a fixed point in the small geography of that part of the town. The child who came for the blancmange powder came because the shop was there, as it had always been there, on the corner of the daily round, a place a child could be sent to on an errand without a second thought. That ordinariness is part of what fixed the horror of the thing in the local memory. The violence had come not to a lonely house on a distant road, but to the familiar shop on the familiar street, into which the neighbourhood walked as a matter of course. The methods available to the investigation in 1930 were the methods of their day, and they framed what could and could not be done. Fingerprinting had become an established tool of the police by that period, and the examination of a scene for the marks of the person who had been there was a routine part of a serious inquiry. Photography of the scene, the taking and recording of statements, the systematic questioning of neighbours and callers, the tracing of movements, these were the instruments of an interwar murder investigation, and they were brought to bear upon the premises at Church Road. But every one of these methods is a method for identifying an unknown person, for building from physical traces and from the accounts of others a picture of someone whose identity is in question. None of them was needed to establish who the attacker was, in the sense that mattered, because there existed a living witness who already knew. The tragedy of the investigation, in the plain and procedural meaning of the word, is that all the apparatus of detection was directed at recovering an answer that one person could have supplied in a single sentence and would not. The involvement of Sir Bernard Spilsbury places the case within a particular chapter of English legal medicine. In the decades on either side of 1930, Spilsbury stood as the preeminent medical witness in the criminal courts of the country. His appearances in the great cases of the age had given his findings an authority that few could challenge, and his word upon a medical question was, in the common estimation of the time, very nearly decisive in itself. In the Wren case, his role was confined to a single, but essential determination, the ruling out of self-infliction, and upon that point his authority did its work exactly as it did in the cases that went to trial. It converted a doubt into a certainty. Where the victim had offered an innocent account of her injuries, the pathologist established that the account could not be true. In this, the case shows the reach of that authority even in a matter that never came before a jury, for there was no defence to contest his finding and no trial in which to test it, and yet his conclusion settled the question of whether a crime had been committed as firmly as if it had been delivered from the witness box. The strangeness of the case has kept it in circulation among those who study and collect the unsolved crimes of England, and the reasons for its persistence are worth setting down, because they explain why a provincial killing of 1930 should be remembered at all. Most murders, even brutal ones, follow a pattern that the mind can complete. There is a victim and a motive, and in time a suspect, and the story closes upon an answer, whether that answer is delivered in a courtroom or merely arrived at in the reasoning of those who followed the case. The Wren case refuses that closure at the very point where closure was most nearly within reach. The victim survived. The victim spoke. The victim was questioned by the right man with the right experience for long enough and remained clear in her mind throughout. Every condition that an investigator could wish for was present, save one, and the one that was absent was the willingness of the witness to tell. The case therefore stands as a kind of demonstration of the limits of investigation itself, of the fact that no amount of skill or diligence can extract a truth that the one who holds it has resolved to keep. There is, too, the particular quality of the words she left, which have carried the case forward as much as any fact of it, that she did not want him to suffer, and that he must bear his sins, are sentences of a kind that lodge in the memory. They are not a riddle exactly, for their meaning is plain enough. They are the statement of a decision, and behind the decision lies a whole relationship, a whole history between the woman and the man, of which those two sentences are the only surviving trace. Everything else of that relationship is gone, if it ever existed beyond her own mind. What remains is the fact that she had, toward the man who killed her, sufficient regard or sufficient pity or sufficient sense of an old bond to spend the last of her strength shielding him from the consequence of what he had done. The words point unmistakably to such a bond. They do not identify it, and so they have the effect of deepening the mystery rather than relieving it, for they confirm that there was a story to be told, while withholding the story itself. The case has been set beside others of its general kind, the killings of solitary shopkeepers and elderly people living alone, of which the interwar years, and indeed every period, furnish their share. The small trader who kept cash on the premises and lived above the shop was, throughout that era, a figure of a certain vulnerability, exposed to the very danger that the belief in hidden savings created. Such killings were not rare, and the pattern of them was grimly familiar to the police of the time. The isolated victim, the presumed money, the sudden violence, the vanished assailant. In its outward form, the Wren case belonged to that familiar pattern, and had it ended, as such cases usually ended, with a stranger caught or a stranger never caught, it would have been remembered no more than the rest of them. What removes it from the pattern is what the victim did, or rather, what she refused to do, in the 5 days that the ordinary killing does not grant. For the ordinary victim of such a crime does not survive to be asked. Margery Wren survived to be asked, and her refusal is what separates her case from the general run of interwar shopkeeper killings, and lifts it into a class very nearly of its own. No change to the law followed from the case, and no reform of police practice, for it exposed no failing that a reform could remedy. The investigation had done what an investigation could do. The failure, if the word applies at all, was not a failure of method or of diligence, but the simple immovable fact of a witness who would not speak. There is no procedure that answers to that. A law cannot compel a dying woman to accuse, and no detective, however skilled, can prize loose a name that its keeper has decided to carry to the grave. The legacy of the case is not therefore a legal or an institutional one. It is the legacy of the human puzzle it left behind, the puzzle of the silence, which has outlasted everyone who was present at the events and which stands now exactly as it stood in the autumn of 1930, unresolved and by every indication unresolvable. The obstinacy that Hambrook attributed to her, the quality he named as the most determined he had met in the whole of his police career, was the quality that governed the outcome. It had shown itself by the accounts of those who knew her throughout her life, in her fierce independence and her secrecy and her guardedness, in the closed back room and the money kept from the banks and the callers turned away. In her death it showed itself finely and completely, turned to the single purpose of protecting the one man she would not name. The same hardness that had made her a difficult and solitary figure in life made her at the end immovable against every effort to draw the truth from her. What in ordinary circumstances might have been called mere stubbornness became, in the circumstances of her death, something harder to name, a resolve exercised against her own interest and against the plain call of justice, in favour of a man who had given her every reason to condemn him, and whom she condemned with not one word. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the first case ends. We turn now to a second story, quieter in some respects than the first, and set in a different decade, one that unfolded not in a seaside town, but in the wooded country of the south, in a district of small holdings and struggling farms. It is a case that was once known across the whole of England, and yet the woman at its centre has been very largely forgotten, remembered chiefly for a dispute between two doctors rather than for herself. It turned in the end upon the same kind of question that the first case could not finally answer. The case of Elsie Emily Cameron begins near Crowborough in Sussex in the winter of 1924. Crowborough was a small town set high on the sandy ridges of the Weald, some 40 miles south of London, surrounded by heath and woodland and by scattered small holdings on which men attempted to make a living from poultry and from the land. The country about the town was not rich. The soil was thin and acid, better suited to gorse and pine than to profitable farming, and the winters came down cold and wet across the open ground. It was a landscape of small wooden huts and fenced runs, of muddy lanes that turned to mire in December, and of holdings that changed hands often as one hopeful proprietor after another failed to make them pay. The place carried, in the years after the Great War, a particular character. A great many young men returned from the war and unwilling or unable to resume the lives they had left, had been drawn into schemes of small holding and poultry farming, encouraged by advertisements and by government talk of settling men upon the land. The reality was frequently hard. A few hundred birds, a wooden hut for the proprietor to live in, a stretch of fenced ground, and a market that paid little for eggs, and less for the labour that produced them. Many such ventures survived only a season or two. The holding at the centre of this case at a spot called Blackness, on the outskirts of Crowborough, was one of these. It was known as the Wesley Poultry Farm, and it never prospered in the whole of its short existence. Crowborough itself was, by the standards of rural Sussex, a place of some modest gentility. It had grown as a health resort in the later part of the previous century. its high situation and clean air recommended to visitors, and it had acquired villas, hotels, and a scattering of retired and comfortable residents. But the small holdings on its edges belonged to a different world, the world of men working small acreages with little capital and less prospect. The two worlds sat close together and did not much mix. It was in the poorer of them, among the huts and the runs, that the events of this case took place in the closing weeks of the year 1924. The town was connected to London by rail, and this connection matters to the account that follows. A traveller could leave one of the London termini in the morning, change as required, and reach Crowborough within a few hours, coming down through the suburbs and out into the wooded country of the Weald. In December of 1924, this was an ordinary journey, undertaken by ordinary people, and it was the journey that Elsie Cameron undertook on the 5th of that month. The modern world of railways, motor buses, wireless sets, and a national press hungry for sensation was fully present in this case. It was not a Victorian story. It belonged to the England of the 1920s, and the newspapers that would shortly seize upon it were the modern popular papers of that decade. Elsie Emily Cameron was born on the 22nd of April in the year 1898. She was, at the time of the events described here, 26 years of age. Her home was in Kensal Rise, in the northwest of London, where she lived with her family. Her father was a man of settled habits and firm character, and he becomes, as the case proceeds, one of its central figures. Elsie worked as a typist, one of the many young women who had found employment in the offices of the capital in the years after the war, and her working life, by every account in the record, was not an easy or a settled one. The sources describe her as a shy, nervous, and unhappy young woman. She'd struggled for a number of years with her nerves, and she'd found it difficult to remain in employment for any length of time. She'd held several posts and had lost or left them, and the record does not conceal that her health of mind was fragile and that her spirits were often low. It is important, in setting down these facts, to describe them only as the sources describe them. The record speaks of nerves, of anxiety, of unhappiness. It does not offer any clinical name for her condition, and none will be supplied here. She was a young woman who had suffered for years with her nerves, and who had come to invest her hopes for the future very largely in one thing, which was her engagement and the prospect of her marriage. That engagement had been formed upon Christmas Day of the year 1922. On that day, Elsie Cameron became engaged to a young man named Norman Thorne. He was a Sunday school teacher and a former electrician who had taken up chicken farming, and he was, to all outward appearance, a respectable and chapel-going young man of the kind that a family might welcome. The engagement was, for Elsie, the fixed point around which her hopes were arranged. She was 26. She had struggled in her work and in her health, and she looked to her marriage as the settlement of her life. For 2 years she waited for that marriage to take place. It did not take place. The 2 years that followed the engagement were years of postponement and of growing distress. The poultry farm, upon which Thorne had staked his prospects, did not prosper. There was never money enough, and the wedding was put off, and put off again for want of it. Elsie remained in London with her family, and Thorne remained in his wooden hut at Blackness, and the marriage that was to have settled her life receded before her. Her letters to him in this period, which afterwards became part of the record of the case, were the letters of a young woman growing increasingly anxious and increasingly desperate as the thing she had waited for failed to arrive. To this was added a circumstance of which Elsie, for a time, knew nothing. In the course of the year 1924, Norman Thorne had formed an attachment to another young woman of the district, named Elizabeth Caldecott. He had not the courage to break off his engagement to Elsie, and so he maintained the one connection while forming the other, and left Elsie in London believing that her marriage, though delayed, would in time take place. The situation by the closing months of 1924 had become one that could not be indefinitely sustained. There was the failing farm, the postponed wedding, the fiancé in London pressing for the marriage, and the other woman near at hand. In her desperation, Elsie wrote to Thorne that she was going to have a child. This was not so. The medical examination that afterwards took place established that she was not, and had not been, with child. The claim must be set down as it stands, plainly and without unkindness. It was made by a young woman who had waited 2 years for a marriage that would not come, whose hopes were fixed upon it, and who was growing frantic as it slipped from her. It was a claim made out of desperation, and it should be understood as such, and not otherwise. Matters came to their crisis in the first week of December. On the 5th of December 1924, Elsie Cameron left her father's house in London. She carried with her a small attaché case containing a few possessions, and she travelled down by rail to Crowborough. Her purpose, as she'd made known to her family, was to bring the long-delayed marriage to its conclusion. She told those at home that she would not return until she and Thorne were wed. She left London that day, and she travelled down into the Sussex country, toward the poultry farm at Blackness. She was never again seen alive by anyone who knew her. This is the last certain point in the account of her movements, and it is well to pause upon it in the manner the record requires. On the morning of the 5th of December, Elsie Cameron was a living woman, 26 years of age, who left her father's house in London carrying an attaché case, and set out for Crowborough, intending to be married. By the evening of that day she had disappeared, and every later account of what became of her rests either upon the physical evidence afterwards recovered from the farm, or upon the statements, changing and contested, of the one man who was present. Those are the two sources, and they must be kept distinct throughout. When she failed to return, and when no word came, her family grew alarmed. Her father, in particular, would not accept that his daughter had simply vanished of her own accord. He knew where she'd gone, and he knew why, and he began at once to make inquiry. What he set in motion, through his refusal to let the matter rest, became the search that in time uncovered the truth of the case. But that came later. In the immediate days after the 5th of December, all that was known was that a young woman had left London for a poultry farm in Sussex, that she had told her family she would not return unwed, and that she had not returned at all. The man to whom she had travelled, when the inquiries reached him, gave a plain and simple answer. He said that Elsie Cameron had never arrived at the farm. He maintained that she had not come to Blackness at all, that he had not seen her, and that he knew nothing of what had become of her after she left London. This was his account, given firmly and repeated in the days and weeks that followed her disappearance. Upon it the first stage of the case turned, for if she had never arrived, then whatever had befallen her elsewhere, and the farm at Blackness had nothing to do with it. But there were those in the district who told a different story. Two local people, going about their own affairs on the 5th of December, afterwards stated that they'd seen a young woman answering to the description of Elsie Cameron, walking up the lane that led toward the poultry farm on that very day. Their accounts placed her in the afternoon upon the road to Blackness, moving toward the holding where Thorne lived and worked. This directly contradicted the account he had given. He had said she never came. They said they had seen her come. Between these two statements, the whole of the subsequent investigation would be fought. Norman Thorne himself requires some description at this point, for he stands at the centre of the case as the man afterwards convicted of the murder. He was a young man of about 24 years, a former electrician who had given up that trade to take up poultry farming upon the land at Blackness. He was a Sunday school teacher, a chapel-going man, outwardly of good and settled character, and it was in part this outward respectability that afterwards so gripped the attention of the public. Here was no obvious figure of violence, but a young man of religious habit and quiet reputation, living in a wooden hut upon a failing farm, engaged to one young woman and secretly courting another. He lived, as has been said, in a wooden hut upon the poultry farmland. His circumstances were poor, The farm did not pay, the birds did not bring in what was needed, and the marriage he had promised could not be afforded. He had formed his attachment to Elizabeth Caldecott, while his engagement to Elsie Cameron still stood, and he had not brought himself to end the one before advancing the other. When Elsie disappeared, he said that she had never arrived. When in time her remains were found upon his land, he changed his account entirely and told a wholly different story. That change, from the first account to the second, lies at the heart of everything that followed. The disappearance of Elsie Cameron was reported to the police, and here the persistence of her father becomes decisive. He was not a man to be satisfied with a slow or a formal enquiry. When the police were slow to act, he wrote to them, and when writing once did not answer, he wrote again. He pressed his inquiry upon the authorities with a steadiness that would not be put off, insisting that his daughter had gone to a known place for a known purpose, and that her disappearance from that place demanded to be investigated. It was this refusal to let the matter fall quiet, more than any other single thing, that kept the case alive through the weeks in which it might otherwise have lapsed. The Sussex Constabulary, as the inquiry took hold, turned their attention to the poultry farm at Blackness. The accounts of the two witnesses who had seen a young woman walking up the lane toward the farm placed the missing woman at the very place her fiancé said she had never reached. That contradiction gave the investigation its direction. If Thorne maintained that she had never come, and if others maintained that she had been seen coming, then the ground he lived and worked upon became the natural object of the search. Officers were directed to the holding, and the decision was taken to examine the land itself. The search of the poultry farm was conducted with method and with patience. The ground was gone over, and the runs in which the birds were kept were examined, and in time the officers began to dig. On the 15th of January 1925, some 6 weeks after Elsie Cameron had left London, the digging produced its first result. Beneath the surface of the ground, the searchers uncovered her attaché case, the small case she had carried with her on the day she travelled down from Kensal Rise. It was the object she had been seen to carry up the lane, and it was now found buried upon the land of the man who had said she never arrived. The discovery of the case was followed by the graver discovery to which it pointed. Continuing their search of the ground and digging beneath the chicken run upon the farm, the officers found the buried remains of Elsie Cameron. She had been dead for some weeks. Her body had been dismembered and concealed in the earth beneath the run. That is the single clinical fact of the disposal, and it will not be dwelt upon further. The young woman who had left London on the 5th of December to be married had been found, in the middle of January, buried upon the small holding to which she had travelled. With that discovery, the first of Thorne's accounts collapsed entirely. He had said that Elsie Cameron never came to the farm. Her attaché case and her remains had now been recovered from the ground of the farm itself. He was taken into custody and confronted with what had been found, and his account changed altogether. He no longer maintained that she had not arrived. He now admitted that she had come to the farm on the 5th of December, and he offered, in place of his first denial, a wholly different explanation of how she had come to die. His revised account was this. He said that Elsie Cameron had come to the hut, and that at some point he had gone out, and that when he returned he had found her hanging from a beam within the hut, having taken her own life. He said that he had been seized with panic at the sight, that he had believed no one would credit his story, that he would be accused of her death, and that in his fear he had cut her down. He said that he had then, in his panic, dismembered the body and buried it upon the farm, in the hope that the whole matter would never come to light. This was the account he now gave, and it was the account he would maintain through his trial. He had found her hanging, he said, and had concealed her death out of fear. Between these two positions the case now stood. The prosecution would contend that Elsie Cameron had arrived at the farm, that a confrontation over the marriage had taken place, that Thorne had killed her, and that he had then concealed the body and told his first false story, that she had never come. Thorne would contend that she had hanged herself, that he had found her dead, and that his only crime was the concealment of a suicide he had panicked at. The physical facts, the arrival, the death, the burial, the attaché case were not in dispute between them. What was in dispute was the manner of her death, and upon that single question the whole of the trial would turn. The investigation, having recovered the remains and taken Thorne into custody, now gathered the evidence upon which the case would be built. Statements were taken from the 2 local witnesses who had seen a young woman upon the lane on the 5th of December, and their accounts became a central part of the prosecution's case, for they established that Elsie Cameron had indeed come to Blackness, as Thorne had at first denied. Her letters were gathered, and her father gave his account of her departure and of her stated purpose in going to Crowborough. The chain that led from the London railway station to the buried remains beneath the chicken run was assembled, statement by statement, in the manner of such investigations. The greater part of the investigation, however, came to rest not upon the movements of the living woman, but upon the condition of the recovered remains, and upon the question of what those remains could be made to disclose about the manner of her death. If she had hanged herself, as Thorne now said, then there should be found upon the body the marks that hanging leaves. If she had been struck down, as the prosecution would contend, then there should be found the marks of violence. It was to the medical examination of the remains, therefore, that both sides looked for the answer, and it was there that the case would be decided. The whole weight of the matter came to bear upon the findings of the physicians. The post-mortem examination for the Crown was conducted by Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the Home Office pathologist, whose name by the year 1925 carried an authority in the criminal courts of England that was very great indeed. He had appeared in case after case, his conclusions had again and again been accepted, and his word had come to be regarded, by juries and by the public alike, as very nearly beyond question. It was Sir Bernard Spilsbury who now examined the remains of Elsie Cameron, and whose conclusions would form the foundation of the case against Norman Thorne. His conclusions, as they bore upon the trial, were these. He found upon the body no marks upon the neck of the kind that hanging would produce. Had the young woman been suspended from a beam by a cord, as Thorne described, there ought, in his view, to have been present upon the neck the distinctive marks of such a suspension, and he stated that these were not there. He found further bruising upon the body, which he attributed to blows, to violence inflicted upon her before her death, and he confirmed the further fact that she was not, and had not been, with child. From these findings he drew the conclusion that Elsie Cameron had not hanged herself, but had been beaten, and that her death was the result of that violence. Had the matter rested there, with the unopposed word of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the case would have presented no great difficulty, for his authority was such that his conclusions were rarely challenged. But in this case, they were challenged directly and publicly, and it is from that challenge that the whole later importance of the case derives. The defence retained a pathologist of its own, Dr. Robert Bronte, who examined the medical evidence and reached conclusions at variance with those of Sir Bernard Spilsbury. Dr. Bronte disputed the significance of the findings and contended that they did not exclude the possibility of hanging, and that the marks and the bruising were capable of an innocent explanation consistent with Thorne's account. The disagreement between the two men was not a small or a technical one. It was a direct and public opposition between two eminent members of the same profession, upon the central question of the case, conducted before the court and reported at length in the press. On the one side stood Sir Bernard Spilsbury, whose reputation was such that his conclusions had come to be treated almost as fact. On the other stood Dr. Robert Bronte, prepared to say in open court that the great pathologist might be wrong. It was one of the first occasions upon which Spilsbury's conclusions had been so publicly and so seriously contested by another man of comparable standing, and this is the reason the case is remembered in the history of forensic medicine. It was not the crime that made it famous, but the clash of the doctors. Before the case came to trial, the law took its ordinary course. A coroner's inquest was convened into the death of Elsie Cameron, as the law required upon the discovery of a body in such circumstances. The inquest was held before the coroner, evidence was received, and the death was inquired into in the formal manner. The occurrence of the inquest is a matter of record, referred to in the proceedings that followed, and it formed one of the stages by which the case passed from the discovery of the remains toward the trial of the man accused. The coroner's proceedings and the magistrate's committal together established the case that would be laid before the assizes. Upon the committal proceedings before the magistrates, Norman Thorne was committed for trial upon the charge of the wilful murder of Elsie Emily Cameron. The evidence gathered by the investigation, the testimony of the witnesses, the medical findings of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, and the account which Thorne himself now gave, were all in due course to be laid before a jury. He was committed to take his trial at the assizes, and he was remanded in custody to await it. The matter now passed from the coroner and the magistrates to the higher court, where it would be tried and where the opposing medical evidence would be set squarely against each other before 12 men. The trial of Norman Thorne commenced at Lewes Assizes in the county of Sussex in the month of March 1925. The case had by this time become a national sensation. The modern popular press had seized upon it, and the details of the poultry farm, the missing typist, the buried remains, and above all the coming battle of the two doctors, were laid before a public that followed them closely. The court at Lewes was crowded for the hearing, and the proceedings were reported day by day. Thorne was arraigned upon the charge of murder, and he pleaded not guilty, and the trial proceeded. The case for the Crown was laid out in order. It was established that Elsie Cameron had left London on the 5th of December, intending to be married, that she had carried an attaché case, and that she had been seen by two witnesses walking up the lane toward the farm on that day, contradicting Thorne's first account that she had never come. It was shown that her attaché case and her remains had been recovered from the ground of the farm. The motive was set before the jury in the documented facts: the failing farm, the postponed marriage, the attachment to Elizabeth Caldecott, and the arrival of Elsie Cameron pressing for a wedding he could not or would not make. And the medical evidence of Sir Bernard Spilsbury was called to establish that the young woman had not hanged herself, but had died by violence. The case for the defence rested upon Thorne's own account and upon the testimony of Dr. Robert Bronte. Thorne maintained that he had found Elsie Cameron hanging in the hut, that he had cut her down, and that in panic and in fear of disbelief he had concealed her death. Dr. Bronte was called to contest the conclusions of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, to argue that the medical findings did not prove that she had been beaten to death, and that they were consistent with, or did not exclude, the hanging that Thorne described. The defence contended that the Crown had not established, to the certainty that a charge of murder required, that Elsie Cameron had died by any hand but her own. The trial extended over several days, and the interest that attended it did not slacken. The two witnesses who had seen a young woman upon the lane were examined and cross-examined, for their evidence was the ground upon which the prosecution rested, its claim that Elsie Cameron had reached the farm at all. The letters that had passed between the engaged couple were before the court, and the account of her departure from London was given, but it was understood, within the court and without, that the true contest of the trial was the contest between the two doctors, and it was to their evidence that the closest attention was paid. Sir Bernard Spilsbury gave his evidence for the Crown with the assurance that his standing had long conferred upon him. He stated his findings, that there were absent from the neck the marks that a hanging would have produced, and that there was present upon the body the bruising of blows, and he maintained that Elsie Cameron had died not by her own hand, but by violence done to her. He was pressed in cross-examination, and he did not yield the substance of his conclusions. His manner in the witness box was that of a man accustomed to being believed, and for many years the courts had believed him. Dr. Robert Bronte then gave his evidence for the defence, and the unusual character of the proceedings became plain. Here was a pathologist prepared to stand against Sir Bernard Spilsbury and to say that his conclusions were not certain. He contested the reading of the marks upon the body and argued that the findings were not inconsistent with the hanging that Thorne described, and that the bruising did not carry the meaning the Crown had placed upon it. He was in his turn examined and cross-examined, and the jury were left with the spectacle of two eminent men of medicine, each of high reputation, directly opposed upon the one question that would decide whether the man in the dock lived or died. The medical dispute was of a kind that the ordinary man of the jury could not readily resolve upon his own knowledge. Neither doctor could be checked by the 12 men against any expertise of their own, and each was obliged to weigh the one authority against the other, and to consider which account the whole of the evidence best supported. The prosecution urged that the physical facts, the concealment, the dismemberment, the first false denial that Elsie Cameron had ever come, all pointed to a man conscious of his guilt, and that these facts lent their weight to Sir Bernard Spilsbury's reading of the medical evidence. The defence urged that a panicked man might conceal a suicide he feared to be blamed for, and that the medical evidence, being contested, could not carry the certainty a conviction for murder demanded. The judge summed up the evidence to the jury, setting before them the case for the Crown and the case for the defence, and directing them upon the law they were to apply. He reminded them of the account Thorne had first given, and of the account he had afterwards given, and of the evidence of the two witnesses, and of the opposed testimony of the two doctors, and he instructed them that they must be satisfied of the prisoner's guilt to the standard the law required before they could convict him. The jury then retired from the court to consider their verdict, and the crowded court awaited their return. The jury retired and deliberated, and in due course they returned to the court. Their verdict was that Norman Thorne was guilty of the murder of Elsie Emily Cameron. Upon the contested medical evidence, upon the testimony of the witnesses, and upon the whole of the facts laid before them, the 12 men had found the case against him proved. The verdict was guilty. Whatever the doctors had disputed, the jury had determined, and they had determined against the prisoner. The court then proceeded to sentence. Upon a conviction for murder, there was in the law of England, as it then stood, but one sentence that could be passed. The judge assumed the black cap and pronounced upon Norman Thorne the sentence of death, that he be taken from the place where he stood to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until he was dead. The sentence was death. It was the sentence the law prescribed and the only one available to the court, and it was passed in the ordinary form. With the verdict and the sentence, the case entered a new stage, for the very feature that had made it a public sensation now became the ground of a public unease. It had been a conviction resting, in large part, upon medical evidence that another eminent doctor had sworn in open court to be unsound. If Dr. Bronte was right, or even if he might be right, then a man was to be hanged upon evidence that was not certain. This disquiet did not remain private. It found expression in the press and in representations made on Thorne's behalf, questioning whether it was safe to carry out a sentence of death, where the medical foundation of the conviction had been so seriously and so publicly contested. Representations were made and petitions were raised, urging that the sentence ought not to be carried out while so grave a doubt attended the evidence. The argument was not that Thorne had been shown to be innocent, for he had not, but that the certainty required to hang a man had not, in the view of those who protested, been reached. The matter came before the Home Secretary, in whom lay the power to advise a reprieve, and upon whose decision the carrying out of the sentence now depended. The whole question of the case had narrowed at the last to whether the contested word of the doctors was a sufficient foundation upon which to end a man's life. The Home Secretary did not intervene. Having considered the case, he found no ground upon which to advise that the course of the law should be stayed, and the sentence of the court was left to stand. The petitions did not prevail, and the representations made on Thorne's behalf did not move the authorities from their decision. The date of the execution was fixed, and Norman Thorne remained in custody at Wandsworth Prison in London to await the carrying out of the sentence that had been passed upon him at Lewes. The execution of Norman Thorne was carried out on the 22nd of April 1925 at Wandsworth Prison. He was hanged there upon that morning, in the ordinary manner prescribed by law for the execution of a capital sentence, some 5 months after Elsie Cameron had left her father's house in London and travelled down to the farm at Blackness. The man who had at first said that she never came, and who had afterwards said that he found her hanging, was put to death for her murder upon the finding of the jury that had tried him. The date upon which the sentence was carried out carries a circumstance that the record preserves and that may be set down plainly. The 22nd of April 1925, the day on which Norman Thorne was hanged at Wandsworth, was the day that would have been Elsie Cameron's 27th birthday. She had been born upon the 22nd of April in the year 1898, and had she lived, she would have completed her 27th year upon the very day that the man convicted of her murder was executed. The coincidence is exact, and it is a matter of the dates as they stand in the record, and nothing need be added to it. The other figures in the case receded after the execution from the public view. Elizabeth Caldecott, the young woman of the district to whom Thorne had formed his attachment, while his engagement to Elsie stood, withdrew from the notice that the trial had briefly thrown upon her, and the record preserves no reliable account of her later life. She had been drawn into the case through no act of her own beyond the connection Thorne had made, and when the trial was over, she passed out of the story. The farm at Blackness, the wooden hut, the runs in which the birds had been kept, belonged now only to the record of what had happened there. For Elsie Cameron's father, the persistence that had driven the search was answered, in the end, by the recovery of his daughter's remains and the conviction of the man who had killed her. It was his refusal to accept her disappearance, his letters that would not stop, his insistence upon inquiry that had kept the case from lapsing into the unresolved silence that swallows so many such disappearances. Whatever the medical dispute that afterwards made the case famous, it was a father's steadiness that had first brought it to the point where such disputes could be argued at all. The record establishes that much, and it is the plainest thing in the whole account. The case did not pass from memory after the execution, though the memory it left was of a particular kind. It was remembered, and it has continued to be remembered, less for the young woman who died than for the contest of the two doctors that decided the man's fate. In the literature of British crime and of forensic medicine, the case took its place as the occasion upon which the great authority of Sir Bernard Spilsbury had first been seriously and publicly challenged. It appeared in the published record of the trial, in the studies of forensic history, and in the accounts of Spilsbury's own career, cited wherever the question of his authority came afterwards to be examined. For the importance the case retained was chiefly this, that it marked a turning in the way the word of a celebrated expert was regarded in the courts of England. For years the conclusions of Sir Bernard Spilsbury had carried a weight that came close to placing them beyond challenge, and juries had convicted upon them as upon established fact. Here, for the first time in so public a manner, another man of the same profession had stood against him, and had said that he might be wrong, and the case had gone on to trial and to execution under the shadow of that disagreement. It fed the long argument pursued for decades afterward over whether any single expert, however eminent, ought to be trusted so nearly without question in matters upon which a man's life depended. That argument was not settled by the case, and it was not meant to be settled by it. Thorne was not exonerated then or afterward. He was not held by later students of the case to have been innocent, and the weight of considered opinion continued to regard him as guilty of the death of Elsie Cameron. What the case left behind was not a doubt of his guilt, but a doubt of the method, a question about the safety of hanging a man upon medical evidence that a competent authority had sworn to be unsound. It stood thereafter as a caution, a case cited whenever the limits of expert certainty came to be discussed, and it has continued to be examined in that light down to the present. The world in which these events had taken place was the world of England between the two great wars, and it is worth setting down the character of that world as it bore upon the case, for it was in no respect a Victorian one. The year was 1924, and the country about Crowborough was crossed by railways that carried Londoners down into Sussex in a matter of hours, by motor buses that ran along the roads, and by the wires that were beginning to bring the wireless into ordinary homes. The newspapers that reported the case were the mass papers of the modern age, printed in their millions and sold across the whole country, and it was through them that the affair of the poultry farm became, within days of the discovery, a matter of national attention. The small holding at the centre of the case belonged to a particular movement of the years after the war. Great numbers of men who had served in the armies of the Great War had come home to a country that could not readily absorb them, and the idea of settling such men upon the land, of establishing them as small proprietors upon a few acres with a flock of birds, had been urged as a remedy both for their want of employment and for the nation's want of food. Advertisements offered instruction and stock and the promise of independence. Companies were formed to supply the birds and the equipment. Young men with little capital and less experience took up plots of thin land and set themselves to make a living from eggs and poultry. The reality of these ventures was, for very many of those who attempted them, a hard and disappointing one. The margins upon eggs were slender, the labour was constant, the weather was against the birds through the wet Wealden winters, and the market paid too little to build a competence upon. A holding of a few hundred birds might keep a single man in the barest way, and no more, and the wooden hut in which such a man lived, set among the runs upon his plot, was a poor foundation upon which to build the married life that Elsie Cameron had waited 2 years to begin. The poverty of the Wesley poultry farm was not an exceptional poverty. It was the common condition of a great many such holdings, and it is the background against which the postponement of the marriage must be understood. Against this background of rural hardship stood the respectability that had so struck the public when the case came to light. Norman Thorne had been a teacher in a Sunday school, a chapel-going young man of good outward character, and it was the distance between that character and the crime of which he was convicted that gave the case much of its hold upon the popular imagination. The chapel and the Sunday school were institutions of standing in such communities, marks of a settled and a decent life, and that a man who bore those marks should have done what Thorne was found to have done was, to the public of 1925, a thing that could not be reconciled and could not be looked away from. There was, too, in the reception of the case, the matter of how the age regarded a young woman in Elsie Cameron's position. She was unmarried at 26. She had struggled to keep her employment. She had suffered for years with her nerves, and she had waited through 2 years of postponement for a marriage that did not come. The claim of a child that was not, made in her desperation, belonged to a time in which such a claim carried a heavy weight of shame, and in which a broken engagement was a matter of consequence in a young woman's life. These were the attitudes of the 1920s, and they bore upon the pressures that had brought her down to the farm at Blackness, resolved not to return unwed. In the years that followed, the case took its settled place in the literature of British crime, and the form of that place is worth describing. It became one of the standard cases recounted in the volumes that gathered the notable trials of the period and set down at length in the published record of the trial of Norman Thorne. It appeared thereafter in the general histories of crime and in the more particular histories of forensic medicine, and it was drawn upon again and again in the accounts of the career of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, where it stood as one of the episodes that could not be omitted. It did not pass into the drama or the folk memory of the country in the way that some cases have done. Its afterlife was a literary and a professional one, an afterlife of books and of studies rather than of ballads or of plays. Within that literature, the case came to be known by the popular names the newspapers had given it: the Crowborough Chicken Farm murder and the Chicken Run murder, names that fixed it in the memory by the circumstance of the poultry farm and the ground beneath the run. These names carried the case forward, and by them it was recognised in the true crime writing of the decades that followed. But the interest that sustained it in that writing was, again and again, the interest of the medical dispute, the clash of Spilsbury and Bronte, rather than the interest of the woman whose death had set the whole matter in motion. It was remembered as a case about evidence, and about the men who gave it. That is the shape of its historical legacy. It is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a landmark in the scrutiny of expert testimony, and in particular in the scrutiny of the man whose testimony had for so long gone unchallenged. Before this case, the conclusions of Sir Bernard Spilsbury had carried in the courts an authority that approached the absolute, and juries had been accustomed to receive them as very nearly the last word upon the matters to which they spoke. The trial at Lewes was the occasion upon which that authority was, for the first time in so public and so consequential a manner, set against the equal authority of another, and the question of its limits raised in the hearing of the whole country. The legacy of the case lay then in the history of forensic medicine and of the law of evidence, rather than in any change of the statutes. No Act of Parliament followed from it, and no rule of law was altered by it. What it altered, so far as it altered anything, was the temper in which the word of a great expert was afterward received, the readiness of the profession and of the public to remember that even the most eminent authority might be wrong, and that the confidence of a single man, however distinguished, was not the same thing as certainty. It fed a caution that grew slowly in the years that followed, a caution about the weight that ought to be placed upon the opinion of any one witness in a matter of life and death, for the case had shown in the plainest way how much could turn upon that weight. A man had been tried, convicted, and hanged, and the medical foundation of his conviction had been contested by a competent authority throughout, and the contest had not been resolved by anything but the verdict of the jury and the decision of the Home Secretary to let the sentence stand. Whether the jury had been right, the case could not finally establish, for the very evidence upon which the question depended was the evidence that had been in dispute. The record could establish that Thorne was convicted, and that he was hanged, and that the medical evidence had been argued over then and was argued over afterward. Beyond that it did not go, and those who studied it most carefully did not pretend that it went further. The plainest facts of the case remained when the disputes around them were set aside, few and settled. A young woman of 26 had left her father's house in London upon the 5th of December 1924, carrying an attaché case, and had travelled down to a poultry farm near Crowborough intending to be married. She had been seen walking up the lane toward the farm. She had not returned, and her father had not ceased to press for her, and upon the 15th of January 1925, her attaché case and her remains had been recovered from the ground of the farm. The man who lived upon that ground had first denied that she came, and had afterwards said he found her dead, and a jury had found him guilty of her murder, and he had been hanged for it at Wandsworth upon the 22nd of April 1925. These facts were not in dispute among the sources, and they are the facts upon which the whole account rests. What was in dispute, and what remained in dispute, was the single question of how Elsie Cameron had died within the hut at Blackness upon that December day, whether by her own hand, as Thorne maintained, or by his, as the Crown contended and the jury found. That question had been carried into the court, and had been left, at the last, where the trial left it. The one man who had been present had given 2 accounts, and the doctors who had examined the evidence had given 2 readings, and the jury had chosen between them upon the whole of the case, and the law had taken its course upon their choice. the certainty that the case demanded, and the certainty that it could in truth supply were not, in the judgment of those who long afterward examined it, quite the same thing. The case of Elsie Emily Cameron was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1925. The case became part of the national record. It has not left. That is where the record of the second case ends. We turn now to the last of these three cases, older than the two that came before it, and set far from the towns already spoken of, in the heart of the capital, in a colder century, where a woman was seen with a stranger on a winter evening and was never afterward able to say who he was. It belongs to a different age from the others, to gaslight and lodging houses and the crowded streets of Victorian London, and yet it turns upon the same difficulty that neither of the earlier records could resolve, the difficulty of a face that could not be fixed and a name that was never learned. The case of Harriet Buswell, known also as Clara Burton, begins in Bloomsbury in central London in the last week of December 1872. She was an Englishwoman of about 27 who occupied a single rented room in a lodging house at number 12 Great Coram Street in the district of St Pancras, and she was found dead in that room on the morning of Christmas Day. London in 1872 was the largest city in the world, a metropolis of some 3.25 million people, its population still swelling year upon year with those who came in from the countryside and from abroad in search of work. The city was lit by gas, its main thoroughfares by tall standards, and its houses by fittings within, and on a late December night the lamps burned through a heavy, coal-laden air that settled over the streets in the cold months. Bloomsbury lay a little to the north and west of the city proper, a district of broad garden squares and long terraces of tall brick houses, built in an earlier and more prosperous generation, and by the 1870s given over, in large part to lodgings, to the letting of rooms, and to a shifting population of clerks, students, foreigners, and those who lived from week to week upon uncertain means. It was respectable in its architecture and mixed in its tenancy, a place where a household of some standing might occupy one house, and a few doors along, a lodging keeper might let out every floor by the room. Great Coram Street ran through this quarter, a street of terraced houses of the ordinary Bloomsbury kind, several stories tall with railed areas before them, and steep internal staircases climbing from the entrance hall to the upper floors. Number 12 was such a house, kept as a lodging house, its rooms let singly to tenants who came and went. A single room on an upper floor was let to the woman known there as Clara Burton. It was a modest accommodation of the sort taken by a person of small and irregular income, furnished plainly, reached by the common staircase, and shut off from the rest of the house by its own door. The house stood within a short walk of the busier streets that led down toward the theatres and music halls of the West End, and it was to those streets and to that life that the woman's evenings were turned. The West End at that time was the centre of the city's public entertainment, and Leicester Square, a little to the south, was one of its principal resorts. On the eastern side of the square stood the Alhambra, a large and celebrated music hall, its front built in an ornate Moorish manner, and its interior given over to variety performances, to ballet and spectacle, to a nightly crowd drawn from every part of London and from among the foreigners passing through it. Around such places gathered the trade and the traffic that attached to them, the sellers of fruit and refreshment at the doors, the cab ranks, the lighted windows of the supper rooms, and the women who earned a precarious living upon the margins of that world. It was a life lived by gaslight and late hours, stigmatised by the respectable and yet bound tightly to the ordinary economy of the district, and it was the life into which Harriet Buswell had drifted. Her earlier history is only lightly preserved in the record, and much of it must be left as a genuine gap rather than filled by supposition. What the surviving accounts establish is that she was an Englishwoman who had come down in the world, that she had at some earlier time been in respectable domestic service, and that she had passed from that settled employment into the uncertain and marginal way of living that brought her to Bloomsbury. Her parents, her birthplace, and the full course of her early years are not recorded in the accessible sources, and no reliable date of her birth survives. Her age at the time of her death was given as about 27, and it is under that description, and no firmer one, that she must be spoken of. One detail of her circumstances is preserved, and it is a detail that explains a great deal about the shape of her life in those final months. She had a child who was not living with her, but was boarded out, cared for elsewhere at her expense. This was a common arrangement for a woman in her position, whose way of earning left no room for the keeping of a child at home, and it placed upon her a constant demand for money that she was ill able to meet. She was, upon all the evidence, chronically short of funds through the closing weeks of 1872, and that want of money bore directly upon the events of the night she died. By the December of that year, she'd been living for some time at Great Coram Street under the name Clara Burton, and the name is itself a mark of her situation, for a woman living as she did commonly went by a name other than her own. The lodging keeper and the other tenants of the house knew her by it. She kept her room, went out in the evenings, and returned, and her comings and goings had in them nothing that marked her out from the others who lived in that manner, until the night of the 24th of December, when her going out and her coming back became the whole substance of a case that occupied the country for a season. The record of that night begins with the plainest of facts, the fact of her being without money. On the evening of the 24th of December, 1872, she borrowed the sum of 1 shilling from a fellow lodger in the house. It was a small loan, the kind of loan that passed between people living close together upon little, and it was made so that she might go out for the evening. With that shilling she left Great Coram Street and went down toward the West End, toward the lights of Leicester Square and the Alhambra, in the way that had become the pattern of her nights. At the Alhambra she was seen in company with a man, and the descriptions of that man, taken afterward from those who had observed the two of them together, form the centre of everything that followed. He was described as quiet in manner, of foreign appearance with a dark moustache, and as speaking with a strong foreign accent. Beyond these particulars, little could be fixed with certainty, and the exact wording of the descriptions varied somewhat from one witness to another, and from one later account to the next. But the substance was consistent across the several who spoke of him. He was a stranger, foreign-seeming, dark-moustached, and he was in her company that evening, as the two of them left the entertainment and turned back toward Bloomsbury. They did not go directly to the house. On the way back through the late streets, they stopped to buy apples and nuts, the small provisions of a winter evening, from a cellar upon the route. This purchase, ordinary in itself, would afterward take on an importance far beyond its worth, for among the fruit carried back to the room that night was an apple that would become one of the most discussed objects in the case. The pair walked on to Great Coram Street with what they had bought, and they entered the house together at a late hour. The lodging-keeper heard them come in. She heard the two of them enter and go up the staircase to the woman's room upon the upper floor, and this was noted and afterward given in evidence, for the household's awareness of the comings and goings within it was one of the few means by which the movements of that night could later be reconstructed. The man was with her, and the two of them went up together, and the door of the room was closed. What passed within the room is not recorded and cannot be, for only 2 persons were present, and one of them did not live to speak of it, and the other was never found. What the record does establish is that the man did not remain. In the small hours of the morning he was known to leave the house, and he left alone. His departure, like his arrival, fell within the awareness of the household, and it is the last documented point in the movements of the unidentified man. He went out into the winter dark of the early morning of the 25th of December and passed beyond the reach of the record entirely. The woman he left behind did not come down, and did not answer, and was not seen alive again. The circumstances of that evening, set out in this plain order, are the whole of what can be reliably said of the hours before the crime. A woman short of money borrowed a shilling and went out. She was seen at a music hall in the company of a quiet, dark-moustached, foreign-seeming stranger. The two of them bought apples and nuts and returned together to her lodging, were heard to go up to her room, and in the small hours the man was heard to leave alone. Every one of these points rests upon the observation of others, upon the fellow lodger who lent the shilling, upon those who saw the couple at the Alhambra, upon the seller of the fruit, and upon the lodging-keeper who heard them come and heard him go. They are the ordinary observations of ordinary people, and they were all that the investigation would have to build upon. The morning of the 25th of December came, and the woman did not appear. It was Christmas Day, and the house had its ordinary business to be about, and as the morning went on, the fact of her silence began to be noticed. Her door remained shut. She did not come down, and she made no sound, and to those in the house who had reason to speak to her, there was no answer when they sought one. A woman who kept late hours might be expected to lie late into the morning, and so at first the silence carried no alarm. But as the hours of Christmas Day advanced, the silence became a thing that could not be ignored. The door of the room was locked. This was a matter afterward much considered, for the room was found closed against those outside it, and the ordinary means of entry did not serve. When at length the household became sufficiently uneasy, the room was opened, and the woman known there as Clara Burton was found within. She was dead. She had died in the night, in the hours after the man had been heard to leave, and she was lying in the room that had been shut upon her. Her throat had been cut. That is the single clinical fact of the injury, and it is all that the record requires to be said of it. The wound was mortal, and death had followed in the night of the 24th to the 25th of December. The discovery was made upon the morning of Christmas Day, in the locked room upon the upper floor, by those of the household who had at last gone to it, and what they found there turned an ordinary Bloomsbury lodging-house into the scene of a murder that would be spoken of throughout the country. There was, upon examination of the room, the mark of something having been taken. Small sums of money were found to be missing, the little that a woman in her circumstances would have had about her, and their absence was noted and afterward formed part of the reasoning of the investigation. A woman who had borrowed a shilling to go out the evening before had little enough to lose, and yet what little there was appeared to be gone. This was among the first observations recorded of the scene, and it bore upon the question of why the thing had been done at all. Among the objects in the room were the remains of the fruit that had been carried back the night before. The apples and nuts bought upon the walk home from the West End lay where they had been left, and among them was an apple that had been partly eaten. Upon that apple were the marks of teeth, distinct impressions left by whoever had bitten into it, and it was this half-eaten apple, more than any other object in the room, that would give the case its lasting character. The apple was preserved by the police as a thing of evidentiary value, set aside and kept in the belief that the marks upon it might serve to identify the man who had been in the room. The discovery of the body upon Christmas Day set in motion the ordinary machinery by which such a death was met. The nature of the injury made plain at once that this was no natural death, and no death by the woman's own hand, and the matter passed immediately into the hands of the authorities. A murder in a lodging-house in the centre of London upon Christmas morning was a thing certain to command attention, and it commanded it swiftly. Word of the death went out, the room was secured, and the investigation that would occupy the winter began. Thus stood the case at its opening. A woman of about 27, living under an assumed name in a single room, had been seen the evening before in the company of a foreign-seeming stranger, had returned with him to her lodging, and had been found in the morning dead behind a locked door. her throat cut, a little money gone, and among the fruit in her room, an apple bearing the marks of a stranger's teeth. Every thread of the matter led back to the man who had come home with her and had left alone in the dark, and it was upon the finding of that man that the whole of the investigation would turn. The investigation into the death was formally taken up by the Metropolitan Police, and it was pursued with the energy that a crime of such public notice demanded. The first task before the officers was the reconstruction of the dead woman's last evening, and for this they had the several persons who had observed some part of it. Statements were taken from those in the lodging house who had knowledge of her movements, from the fellow lodger who had lent her the shilling, and from the keeper of the house who had heard the two of them come in and had heard the man go out again in the small hours. From these accounts the outline of the evening was established: the borrowing of the shilling, the going out toward the West End, the return with a companion, and his solitary departure before the dawn. The officers went next to the places the couple had passed through, and above all to the Alhambra in Leicester Square, where the two of them had been seen together. There the police sought out those who had observed the man in the woman's company and took from them their descriptions of him. The accounts gathered agreed in their principal features. The man was of foreign appearance, quiet in his manner, with a dark moustache, and he had spoken with a strong foreign accent. Some of those who had seen him spoke also of his teeth, a particular that took on weight because of the marks upon the apple, for if the man's teeth were of a noticeable character, then the bitten apple might be made to answer to them. The fruit seller from whom the apples and nuts had been bought was found and questioned, and the purchase upon the walk home was confirmed. From these descriptions the police composed the figure of the man they sought, and the description was circulated in the ordinary way. A foreign-looking man, dark-moustached, of strong accent, last seen leaving Great Coram Street in the early hours of Christmas Day, became the object of a search that reached beyond London. The difficulty was evident from the first. The description, though consistent, was general, and it answered to a great many men in a city through which foreigners passed in large numbers, by way of its docks and its railways, and the shipping that used the ports of the southern coast. The very feature that had fixed the man in the memory of the witnesses, his foreignness, was also the feature that made him one of thousands. The preserved apple was, in this early stage of the inquiry, treated as an object of real evidentiary promise. The reasoning applied to it was plain enough. If the marks of the teeth upon the fruit were distinct, and if the man who had bitten it could be found, then the one might be compared against the other, and the comparison might serve to fix his identity. Taken together with the descriptions given by the witnesses of the man's teeth, the apple was held to offer a means of identification beyond the ordinary recollection of a face. It was an early instance of the use of such physical reasoning in a murder inquiry, and it was pursued in earnest, though it must be understood that it proved in the end no forensic triumph and secured no conviction. The apple was a promising object, and no more. As the inquiry proceeded, the attention of the police came to be directed toward the shipping upon the southern coast, and in particular toward a German steamship, the Wangerland, which was at that time laid up at Ramsgate. The vessel carried among those aboard her a number of foreign passengers, and it was among these that the description of the wanted man was thought to find an answer. The trail that had begun in a Bloomsbury lodging house led now down to the Kentish coast, to a steamship held in port, and to the passengers who waited aboard her, and it was there that the investigation fixed upon a particular man. The man upon whom the police fixed was Dr. Gottfried Hessel, a German clergyman, a pastor by his calling, who was travelling as a passenger aboard the Wangerland and was staying in the vicinity of Ramsgate while the vessel lay in port. He was a man of settled and respectable profession, a minister of religion, and there was nothing in his station that answered to the crime laid at the door of the man who was sought. He came under the notice of the investigation for a single reason, that his appearance was thought to accord with the description that the witnesses had given. The foreign look, the dark moustache, the manner of a stranger passing through England. Upon that resemblance, and upon nothing surer, the machinery of the law now began to move toward him. It must be said plainly, at the point where his name enters the record, that Dr. Hessel was an innocent man. He had no part in the death of Harriet Buswell, and the proceedings that followed established his innocence and left it beyond question. He was a clergyman going about the ordinary business of a traveller, caught up in a murder inquiry through the accident of his appearance and the readiness of the age to fix upon a foreigner, and everything that was afterward done to clear his name was rightly done. His profession was that of a pastor and no other. Nothing in his calling furnished any means or occasion for the crime, and no such connection was ever soundly made. He was suspected because he looked to certain eyes like the man who had been described, and for that alone. The means by which suspicion hardened into a charge was the identification of Dr. Hessel by witnesses. Several of those who had seen the man in the dead woman's company, or who had observed the couple upon their way, were brought down to where the Wangerland lay, or were otherwise given the opportunity to look upon him, and a number of them identified him with confidence as the man they had seen. Their certainty was real. They did not hesitate, and they did not qualify what they said. They looked upon Dr. Hessel and declared him to be the foreign-seeming stranger of the 24th of December, and it was upon the strength of their identifications, given firmly and in good faith, that he was taken into custody and brought to answer the charge. He was conveyed to London and brought before the magistrates at Bow Street, where the preliminary proceedings against a person accused of so grave a crime were conducted. The Bow Street Police Court was the place at which the evidence against an accused man was first laid out and weighed, to determine whether the case was such as ought to be sent forward for trial. The proceedings against Dr. Hessel opened there in the early weeks of 1873, and they became at once a matter of the closest public interest. A foreign clergyman, identified by several witnesses as the murderer of a woman in a Bloomsbury lodging-house upon Christmas Eve, stood before the magistrates in a case that had already seized the attention of the whole country, and the courtroom and the columns of the press followed every stage of it. The case presented against him rested principally upon the identifications. Witness after witness was called who had seen the man with Harriet Buswell, and a number of them swore to Dr. Hessel as that man. Had the matter rested there, the weight of so many confident identifications might have carried him toward a trial. But the defence that was raised on his behalf did not rest there, and it was in the answering of the identifications that the case against him came apart. For Dr. Hessel was able to account for himself upon the night in question, and the account he gave was capable of being tested and confirmed. His alibi was thorough. He was able to show by the evidence of others, and by the circumstances of his situation, where he had been during the hours in which the crime was committed, and his account did not admit of his having been in London at Great Coram Street upon that night. The particulars of his movements were laid before the magistrates and were examined, and they held. As the alibi was established, the identifications that had seemed so firm began to lose their force. For confident though the witnesses had been, their certainty could not stand against a demonstration that the man they named had been elsewhere. Under cross-examination, the identifications were probed, and the differences and difficulties in them were drawn out, and one by one they were shown to be unsafe. This was the heart of the matter, and it is the reason the case is remembered as it is. Several witnesses, honest and sure of themselves, had looked upon an innocent man and had declared him to be a murderer, and they had been wrong. Their error was not wickedness and was not perjury. It was the ordinary failing of human recollection, the readiness of the eye to find in a stranger's face the features it has been told to look for, and it was displayed at Bow Street in the plainest possible form. The confidence of an identifying witness, the proceedings showed, was no measure of its truth, for men had sworn to Dr. Hessel without a doubt in the world, and had been mistaken in every particular that mattered. As the evidence for the defence was completed and the case against the accused fell away, the magistrates came to the only conclusion the state of the evidence permitted. Dr. Hessel was discharged. The case against him was not sent forward for trial. He was released from the charge and from custody, a free man, his innocence established in open court, and there was no committal of him or of anyone else to stand trial for the murder of Harriet Buswell. The gravest charge that the law could bring had been laid against him and had been answered and undone, and he walked out of the proceeding cleared. His discharge was met with a marked public sympathy. The reversal had been complete and had been public, and the country that had followed the case against him now saw an innocent man vindicated, and it responded with warmth. There was applause at his release, an expression of the general feeling that a wrong had been narrowly averted, and that the man before them had been ill-used by the suspicion that had fallen on him. And the matter did not end with sympathy alone. In recognition of the wrong that had been done to him, of the arrest and the public accusation and the peril in which he had stood, Dr. Hessel was afterward the beneficiary of a payment raised for him by public subscription, a sum given in acknowledgement that he had been wrongly suspected and wrongly charged. It was a notable instance of public feeling, making some amends to a man the law had accused in error. With the discharge of Dr. Hessel, the investigation was left without a suspect, and it was never again to have one. The man who had come home with Harriet Buswell upon the night of the 24th of December, who had gone up with her to her room and had left it alone in the small hours, was never identified. The description of him remained upon the record. The quiet manner, the foreign look, the dark moustache, the strong accent, and the marks of teeth upon an apple remained among the preserved things of the case. But neither the description nor the apple ever led to a man who could be charged. The one arrest the inquiry had produced had ended in a vindication, and beyond it there was nothing. The medical examination of the body was conducted in the ordinary course, as the law required in every case of violent or suspicious death. A surgeon was called to examine the remains of the dead woman, to determine the cause of her death, and to fix, so far as the condition of the body allowed, the time at which it had occurred. The examination established that the injuries were severe, and that they had been rapidly fatal, and that the cause of death was the wound to the neck. This was the whole of the medical conclusion so far as it bears upon the record, and the detail of the surgeon's findings, set down at length in the contemporary papers, need not be recited beyond the single fact of a mortal injury from which death had swiftly followed. The time of death, as the medical examination fixed it, was consistent with the account that the household had given of the night. Death had occurred in the small hours of the morning of the 25th of December, in the period after the man had been heard to leave the house, and the surgeon's estimate accorded with that sequence. The body had lain in the closed room through the later hours of the night and into the morning until the discovery was made, and the state of the remains answered to a death that had taken place in the darkness before the dawn of Christmas Day. There were no findings of pregnancy or of any other condition that bore upon the case, and the medical evidence added nothing to the question of who had done the thing, only to the questions of how and when. The name of the surgeon who conducted the examination is not a matter that the record requires to be fixed, and it is enough that the examination was made by a qualified medical man in the proper way, that the cause of death was established, and that his findings were afterward laid before the coroner's inquest. The medical evidence in a case of this kind served two purposes: to establish beyond doubt that the death was a murder, and not a death by natural cause, or by the woman's own act, and to place before the inquest the material upon which a verdict might be founded. Both purposes were served. The death was shown to be murder, and the findings passed to the coroner for the inquiry that the law demanded into every such death. A coroner's inquest is the official inquiry into a death that is sudden, violent, or of unknown cause, conducted by the coroner for the district, and it was before such an inquiry that the death of Harriet Buswell was next brought. The coroner for the district in which he had died convened his inquest in the days that followed the discovery, empanelling a jury as the law required and taking evidence upon the circumstances of the death. The inquest was not a trial and did not determine the guilt of any particular person. Its office was to establish who the dead person was and how, when, and where she had come by her death, and to return a verdict upon those matters. Before the coroner and his jury, the witnesses to the last evening were heard, and the surgeon who had examined the body gave his medical evidence, and the facts of the night were laid out in their order. The identity of the dead woman was established, both under the name by which she was known at Great Coram Street and as Harriet Buswell. The circumstances of her going out, her return in company, and the departure of the man were placed upon the record. The medical evidence established the cause and the manner of her death, and upon the whole of this the jury was directed to consider its verdict. The verdict of the coroner's inquest was one of wilful murder against a person unknown. The jury found, as the evidence compelled them to find, that Harriet Buswell had been murdered, that her death had been a deliberate and unlawful killing, and that the person who had committed it could not be named. This was the formal record of the manner of her death, entered by the proper authority, and it fixed the character of the case in law as an unsolved murder from the very outset. The inquest could go no further than the evidence, and the evidence, though it established the fact of murder plainly enough, furnished no name to attach to it. Against a person unknown, the verdict stood, and against a person unknown, it would remain. It must be understood that the proceedings against Dr. Hessel at Bow Street and the inquest before the coroner were distinct inquiries, serving different ends. The inquest determined that a murder had been committed, and by whom it could not be said. The magistrate's proceeding tested whether a particular man ought to be sent for trial, and concluded that he ought not. The one returned a verdict of wilful murder against a person unknown, and the other discharged the only man ever brought before it, and the two together left the case exactly where the morning of Christmas Eve had left it, a plain murder with no author that the law could name. There was, in the end, no committal of any person to trial, and so the case never came before a jury upon the question of guilt. This is a matter that should be stated without qualification. The murder of Harriet Buswell never reached a criminal trial. No one was ever committed to the assizes or to the Central Criminal Court to answer for her death. The nearest the case ever came to a trial was the hearing at Bow Street, and that was a preliminary proceeding only, ending in a discharge rather than a committal. The great apparatus of an English criminal trial, the arraignment, the empanelling of a jury, the case for the Crown and the case for the defence, the summing up and the verdict, was never brought to bear upon the death, because there was never an accused person against whom the evidence was thought sufficient to proceed. The case passed from the inquest and the magistrate's court directly into the condition in which it has remained, unresolved. With no committal and no trial, there followed no conviction, and with no conviction, there followed neither sentence nor punishment. No man was sentenced for the murder of Harriet Buswell, and none was imprisoned or otherwise dealt with for it, because the law had found no man to deal with. The whole procedure of sentencing, which in a concluded case would have followed upon a verdict of guilty, had no occasion to begin. The record of the case in this respect is simply blank. Where in another matter there would stand a verdict, a sentence, and the carrying out of a punishment, here there stands nothing, for the person who had done the thing was never found and never answered for it in any court. The one act of the state that did follow, and it is the aftermath most worth the setting down, concerned not the guilty man but the innocent one. The payment made to Dr. Hessel in recognition of the wrong done to him stands as the single formal consequence that the case produced. A man had been arrested, held, publicly accused of murder, and brought within the shadow of the gallows, and had then been shown to be entirely innocent, and the public acknowledged the error and made him some amends for it. That acknowledgement and the public sympathy that accompanied his release were the true aftermath of the case, for they attached to the one figure in it whose fate the proceedings had been able to determine. The murder remained unpunished, and the amends made were made to the man wrongly suspected of it. The case of Harriet Buswell has been remembered above all for what it demonstrated about the reliability of eyewitness identification, and it is worth setting out plainly what that demonstration consisted in. It was not a case of a wrongful conviction, for there was no conviction, and the error was caught before it could be carried into a trial and a verdict. It was a case of wrongful accusation, arrested at the stage of the preliminary hearing, and its value lay precisely in the completeness with which the mistake was exposed while there was still time to undo it. Several witnesses had identified Dr. Hessel, and every one of them had been wrong, and the fact that so many honest people could be so wrong together was the lesson the case left behind. The witnesses who identified him were not few, and they were not uncertain. They had come forward and had sworn to him as the man they had seen with the dead woman, and they had done so with a confidence that admitted no doubt. Yet the alibi proved that the man they named had not been where they placed him, and so the whole body of their testimony, confident and numerous as it was shown to be mistaken. The case stood thereafter as a documented instance of a truth that the courts have had to reckon with ever since, that the certainty of a witness is not a guarantee of the accuracy of what the witness says, and that a mistaken identification made in good faith may be as dangerous to an innocent man as a deliberate lie. There was in the record no favoured suspect who might be put in Dr. Hessel's place. The discharge of the one accused man did not point toward another. The description of the true perpetrator remained what it had always been, the general description of a foreign-seeming, dark-moustached, strongly accented stranger, and it answered to no particular man who could be found and charged. The evidence supported the naming of no one, and the honest condition of the case was that its author was simply unknown. It has remained unknown. No later inquiry, no subsequent confession, no fresh evidence has ever supplied the name that the winter of 1872 failed to supply, and the murderer of Harriet Buswell passed out of the reach of the law in the small hours of Christmas Day and was never brought back within it. The apple that had been preserved, the object upon which so much early hope had been placed, is remembered as one of the two enduring particulars of the case. The reasoning applied to it, that the marks of a man's teeth might be matched to the teeth of a suspect and so identify him, was an early reaching toward a kind of physical proof that the science of the day was not yet able to supply with any certainty. It secured nothing. No man was convicted upon the evidence of the apple, and the comparison of the bite to any living mouth never fixed the identity of the killer. Yet the apple has kept its place in the memory of the case as an early and striking instance of an attempt to read a crime from the physical traces left at the scene, and it is recalled as such, a promising object that promised more than the age could make it yield. The other enduring particular is the figure of the wrongly accused foreign pastor, and it is around these two things, the bitten apple and the innocent clergyman cleared in open court, that the memory of the case has arranged itself. The great Coram Street murder, as it came to be called, took its place among the best remembered of the unsolved crimes of Victorian London, spoken of and written of in the years that followed and revisited by those who concern themselves with the criminal history of the city. It was a crime that had gripped the country through a single winter, that had produced a sensation, a suspect, a public trial of identification and of vindication, and had then closed upon a mystery that was never solved, and such cases are not easily forgotten. In the cultural memory of Victorian crime, the great Coram Street murder has held a durable place, though not a dramatic one. It did not pass into a great canon of literature or of the stage, and it did not gather about itself the vast popular afterlife of certain other London mysteries of the century. Its persistence has been of a quieter kind in the literature of true crime and of London's criminal history, in the antiquarian record of the city's unsolved cases, and in the accounts that later gathered the notable murders of the period into their pages. It is a case cited and retold rather than dramatised, remembered as a mystery and as a lesson, and it has been revisited in modern reconstructions and in discussions of the crimes that preceded the more notorious murders of the later part of the century. Its recurrence in that literature owes much to its standing as a murder of the metropolis that was never solved, and something also to its place in the history of criminal identification, for the bitten apple and the collapse of the eyewitness case have given it an interest to those who trace the development of forensic reasoning and the difficulties of proof. It is discussed among the preeminent unsolved cases of Bloomsbury and of central London, a crime of the early 1870s that the police pursued with vigour and yet could not bring home, and it is remembered as one of the mysteries that the Victorian capital left unresolved behind it. The two motifs of the apple and the wronged pastor have carried it forward, and it is by them that it is most often recalled. The legacy of the case considered as a whole is that of an unsolved murder and of a cautionary episode in the history of evidence, rather than that of a matter that changed the law or reformed the courts. It did not produce a statute or a great reform. What it produced was a memory, and within that memory, two things of lasting note: the demonstration that confident eyewitnesses may be wholly mistaken, and the early attempt to found identification upon a physical trace. The payment made to Dr. Hessel has been cited since as an early example of the public acknowledging a wrongful accusation and making some redress for it, a small but notable point in the long history of the treatment of those whom the law accuses in error, and it belongs to the legacy of the case as much as the mystery itself. The world in which the crime occurred was the world of early 1870s London, and it is worth holding that setting steadily in view, for the case belongs entirely to it. It was a crime of the gaslit metropolis, of the crowded lodging houses of Bloomsbury and the bright resorts of the West End, of the music halls about Leicester Square, and the precarious lives of the women who moved upon their margins. It was a crime of a Christmas in the great city, of a borrowed shilling and a walk home through cold streets, of apples and nuts bought upon the way, and a door found locked upon a winter morning. And it was a crime of a metropolis through which foreigners passed in great numbers, by its docks and its railways, and the shipping of its southern ports, so that when a foreign-seeming stranger was sought, the search led naturally to a steamship laid up upon the coast and to the passengers aboard her. The lodging houses of Bloomsbury were a settled feature of the district by the time of the crime, and the manner of life within them bears directly upon how the case unfolded. The tall terraced houses, built in an earlier day for single families of some means, had in many streets been divided and let out room by room, each floor, and sometimes each room, a separate tenancy, so that a single house might hold within it a dozen lives that touched one another only upon the common staircase. The keeper of such a house let the rooms, collected the rents, and knew, in a general way, who came in and who went out. But the tenants lived their own hours and kept their own company, and a woman who received a visitor late at night did nothing that the house had not seen before. It was a form of living that afforded a measure of privacy and, with it, a measure of danger, for a stranger admitted to an upper room passed almost unremarked by those below. It was this ordinary circumstance that made the reconstruction of the last evening both possible and incomplete. The household could say that the woman had gone out, that she had returned with a man, that the two had gone up together, and that the man had come down alone in the small hours, because these were the comings and goings that the common life of the house made audible to those within it. But the household could not say who the man was, for he was a stranger admitted for a night, in the way that such houses admitted strangers, and there was no one in the place to whom his face meant anything beyond the general impression it had left. The very arrangement that had allowed his movements to be traced had ensured that he could pass through the house without being truly known to it. The economy of the West End, into which the woman's evenings led her, was one of the great engines of the city's public life, and its margins were populous. The theatres and the music halls drew their crowds nightly from across London and from among the visitors and foreigners who filled the central districts. And about the doors of those places gathered the whole apparatus of an evening's trade, the cabs and the fruit sellers, the lighted supper rooms, the sellers of every small thing that a crowd upon a night out might want. Among this traffic moved the women who lived upon it, upon the fringe of a world of pleasure and expenditure, earning their livings precariously and under the disapproval of the respectable. And it was among them that Harriet Buswell had made her place. The purchase of apples and nuts upon the walk home, a small and homely act, belonged wholly to this world, the ordinary commerce of a late street through which two people passed on their way to a room. The readiness of the investigation to fix upon a foreigner, and the ease with which the search moved from a Bloomsbury room to a steamship upon the Kentish coast, is likewise to be understood through the character of the city at that time. London in the 1870s was a place through which foreign nationals passed in very great numbers, by way of the shipping that used the ports of the south and east, by way of the railways that carried travellers to and from the continent, and by way of the trade and the enterprise that drew men of every nation into the metropolis. A description that fixed upon a man's foreignness, his accent and his look, narrowed the field far less than it might have seemed to, for the field was very wide. And yet the same feature that made the description weak as a means of identification made it strong as a direction for suspicion, for a public and a police alike were prepared to believe that so strange a crime, done by a stranger, had been done by a stranger from abroad, and the search followed that expectation to the vessel at Ramsgate. The pursuit of the Wangerland and of her passengers shows the investigation reaching, with real diligence, along the one line that the evidence seemed to offer. The description of the wanted man had been circulated, and where a foreign-seeming man answering to it might be found, there the inquiry went. A steamship laid up in port, carrying foreign passengers, was exactly such a place, and the police followed the lead to it, and brought their witnesses down, to look upon those aboard. That the line ended in the identification of an innocent man does not mean it was carelessly followed. It was followed as the methods of the day directed, by the gathering of descriptions and the confronting of a suspect with those who claimed to have seen the man, and it was the very thoroughness with which that method was applied that produced, in the end, the confident and mistaken identifications that the alibi then overturned. There is in the whole conduct of the case a plain illustration of how far the investigation of murder had advanced by the early 1870s, and how far it had not. The police could reconstruct a victim's last evening from the testimony of those about her, could circulate a description across counties, could pursue a suspect to a ship upon the coast, and assemble witnesses to confront him, and could preserve a physical object from the scene in the belief that it might one day identify a man. These were the marks of a capable and modern inquiry. But the means to turn a description into a certain identification, or a bitten apple into proof, did not yet exist, and so the capable inquiry ran its full course and arrived at no solution. It could find a suspect and it could clear him, but it could not find the man who had actually done the thing, and there its power ended. The public attention that the case commanded through the winter of 1872 and into 1873 was itself a part of its character, for this was a crime followed by the whole reading nation as it unfolded. The murder upon Christmas Eve, the search for the foreign stranger, the arrest of the pastor, the proceedings at Bow Street, the collapse of the identifications, and the discharge and the compensation, were reported at every stage and followed with an interest that few cases of the period excited. It was a sensation of its season, and the intensity of that public interest is one reason the case was so well recorded and so long remembered. For a great volume of newspaper report survives to fix its chronology and its detail. The going out upon the 24th, the finding upon the 25th, the Alhambra, the fruit, the apple, and the whole of the Hessel episode. Yet for all the attention and for all the diligence of the police, the plain shape of the matter never altered from what the morning of Christmas Eve had established. A woman was dead in a locked room. A stranger had been with her and had gone, and the stranger was never found. The season's sensation ran its course and subsided. The innocent man returned to his obscurity, with his name cleared and his amends paid, and the case settled into the condition in which it has rested ever since. A well-documented and much-discussed murder of Victorian London, to which no author was ever attached. The description remained upon the record. The apple remained among the preserved things, and the man who had walked out of Great Coram Street into the dark of Christmas morning remained, as he had been from the first, unknown. The case of Harriet Buswell was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. An innocent man was cleared before the whole country and repaid for the wrong done to him, and he passed back into his quiet life, with his name restored. The man who had gone up the staircase at Great Coram Street on the night of the 24th of December, and had come down alone before the dawn, walked out of that winter of 1872 and was never seen again by the law. The identity of the perpetrator was not established. No conviction followed. None was ever sought.